We are in the sixth and last chapter of Galatians, and we should finish that up this evening. Next quarter, Ian Jones will be teaching Sundays, and Jeff Marshall will be teaching Proverbs on Wednesdays. So that will be coming up as this quarter is terminating. I suspected that Travis and Vance would be tough acts to follow. But guys, and then on top of that, we throw in 5 lessons from Mike Wilson as well. So I'm thinking their expectations have got to be sky high. But fortunately, I taught chapter 1, so your expectations aren't sky high. They're not really that high. Okay, they're down there. Anyway, from that movie, Tom Cruise, he said, with me, without me. With me, without me. And anyway, I don't remember the title, but you'll have to watch it sometime. Galatians chapter 6 is in many ways a standalone chapter. That is, there are passages that can be quoted from chapter 6, short passages that get a message across. But we have to also understand that chapter 6 is integral to the entire context of the epistle to the Galatians. That means it's in there for a purpose because it fits with the rest of the book. Let me give you an example, or examples. We start out in chapter 1, and in verse 6, what's the 2 problems that Paul talks about? Verse 6, that he's going to have to deal with in his entire epistle. What's the 2 problems? What does he say about their faith at the time? They're so soon removed, or they're deserting the gospel, he says. And he also tells us that there is a second problem that they have to deal with. And I'm convinced that if Paul had access to a dry erase board, he would have used it too. So, what's the second problem? Okay, that's the first problem, deserting the gospel or going to a different gospel or turning to another gospel. The same phrase is the same thought is mentioned with different phrases. And what was the second problem? What they have there with them in the congregation they had to deal with and didn't know it? What does it say in the phrase following their deserting the gospel? They had those who were some among them who were disturbing them. So not only did they have a problem with their faith and it was deserting or turning away from the gospel, but they also had those who were also disturbing the members. Those who were teaching things that were not in accordance with the gospel. Okay, that's the 2 problems he not only deals with in chapter 1, but he deals with throughout all the book of Galatians. So that's why we have to understand the context of the book and understand why chapter 6 is so integral to that context. He goes on to say, because there's those who are disturbing him and disturbing them, and in order to disturb them, they have to discredit somehow Paul, otherwise they have no esteem, no respect, no status in the congregation. So the rest of chapter 1, he's talking about his own credentials, shall we say. That he was given by revelation the gospel of Christ, and that's what he was teaching. Not only that, what was Paul's former life? What was his former life? He was a Pharisee, but not only a Pharisee, but what? A chief Pharisee. He was moving up in the world. I suspect that if he had remained a Pharisee, he would have been an important member of the Sanhedrin there in Jerusalem, because he was up and coming. He had status, he had reputation, he had esteem, he had respect from his colleagues, not only from those around, but even the very upper class of the priesthood. And he gave that up. And that's what he tells the Galatians. I gave that up for the sake of what? The gospel of Christ. Now, there in the Galatians that he's talking about, they may have, and probably did, witness the stoning that Paul went through in the province of Galatia when he was first preaching the gospel. It talks about those Pharisees who were jealous and angry with Paul. And through that jealousy, they stoned him and then dragged him out of the city, remember, thinking he was dead? Acts chapter 13. So, he tells them what the problem is. The rest of chapter 1, he deals with his own reputation, that he is not doing this for personal glory. He is doing this for the sake of the gospel of Christ. Then he goes on to chapter 2. And as chapter 2 opens, it's kind of interesting. Let me get rid of this and that. We read in verse 2, and it was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel, which I preach among the Gentiles, but I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. When he says going up to, where was he going? Jerusalem. Whenever you went to Jerusalem, you always went up. You always went up, no matter where you were. Well, he went up, and there he and Barnabas and Titus met with other of the apostles. They met with Peter, they met with John, James was there. And what the problem they addressed were those Jews who were trying to integrate the rites and rituals of the law of Moses into the new gospel. And that's what they dealt with in that particular meeting in Jerusalem. Now, when you pack a room full of prophets who are inspired by God, what do you end up with? You end up with the Word of God that has now been preached. And they resolved, in that meeting, they resolved what they were going to do, and that they were not going to allow the rites of the particularly circumcision, they were not going to allow that to become part of the gospel because it didn't belong there. So, to the Galatians, what Paul is saying is, we solved the problem. I went up and met with the other apostles, and we solved this problem. The law of Moses does not belong in the gospel. In fact, we read about later in chapter 2, we read about how Paul confronted Peter. Because Peter, when he came to Antioch and he brought Jews with him, he had no problem consorting with Gentiles. But when they were in Antioch, he would kind of stick with the guys, the other Jews, and he would kind of segregate himself. Paul knew that this was wrong because of what they had solved there in Jerusalem. He had no business doing that. That was not promoting the gospel. And so in verse 18, for if I rebuild what I have once destroyed, I prove myself to be a transgressor. This is what he's telling the Galatians about when he confronted Peter. For through the law I died to the law that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. That's the point he's making to them. I have been crucified with Christ, and it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and delivered himself up for me. Remember, he's telling this to the Galatians. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. He's trying to make a point, and the point lasts for 6 chapters. Now, if you were, most likely, most of the members of the church there in the churches in the province of Galatia were probably populated with Jews. They may have, and they probably actually outnumbered the Gentiles. But if you were a Gentile and you had been converted, and now Paul is talking about the Old Testament, would you have a little trouble with that? What would you know about the law of Moses? Probably 0, because you were converted out of polytheism. Probably there in Galatia, they called their gods by the Greek names. The Romans tended to rename the Greek gods. But they probably called their polytheistic religion the gods by the Greek names that the Greeks had given to them. And so Paul starts talking about the law of Moses. Where are you? Are you saying, I know this, I got this? Would that be your case? Absolutely not. It's like talking a foreign language. So not only does he have to correct them about integrating the law of Moses into the gospel and how wrong that is, he has to explain to them the law of Moses. So now that's going to extend his letter, because not only does he have to say you're wrong, he has to say why you're wrong, because there are so many members probably who have no idea what he's talking about. And that's what we run into there in the end of chapter 2. He has to explain, and he has to give explanation. In chapter 3, he goes on, and he says, even so Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Who is Abraham? The Jews in those congregations, they know who Abraham is, but the Gentiles, they don't have. You got a picture, you got ID, you got something, I don't know who you're talking about. So that's why Paul has to spend a little extra time explaining who Abraham is or was, and why they are sons of Abraham. He says, therefore be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham, and the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations shall be blessed in you. Is it important that those Gentiles in the churches in Galatia understand the Old Testament? Yes. Yes. Because of this phrase that he mentions there in 7. Be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of whom? Abraham. Sons of Abraham. Did you have a question?
I think this chapter 3 is probably one of the most outstanding chapters, maybe not in the Bible, but in the New Testament, because, that promise that was made back to Abraham in the patriarchal law skirted the law of Moses. And here he says, if you're in Christ and you're heirs to the promise, I mean, I get chills in my spine thinking about the fact that if we're obedient to the gospel, we can be heirs to the promise that was made back thousands of years ago.
Right, and that's a point that Paul makes. Not only is it important that you understand who Abraham was and that you become sons of Abraham, but the point he's going to make is Abraham's promise predated the law of Moses. And that's an important factor he has to deal with as well. So when you start talking to Gentiles about Abraham, about the law of Moses and all that stuff, there's such a fog that you can create with them. So you have to be very careful, and that's what Paul is doing. He's being very careful to help them understand the thought process, because he's going to be getting to the meat of what he's talking about here very soon. Going on in chapter 3, for if the inheritance is based on law, it is no longer based on a promise, but God has granted it to Abraham by means of a promise. Why the law then? Any Jew probably has answered that in their own mind, but the Gentiles haven't. It was added because of transgressions, having been ordained through angels by the agency of a mediator, until the seed should come to whom the promise has been made. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? Absolutely not. But he's going to have to explain why that's the case. May it never be, for if a law had been given which was able to impart life, then righteousness would indeed have been based on law. Where has he gone in the book of Galatians thus far? He's trying to differentiate between the law of Moses and the gospel of Christ. The point he's making is from the law. What was the purpose of the law? The law of Moses. Why was it there? Because of transgressions. And what purpose did it serve because of transgressions? Romans says that the law was there to give a knowledge of what? Knowledge of sin. Knowledge of sin. That's the purpose of the old law. The purpose of the old law was not to save. The purpose of the old law was not to bequeath to us righteousness, because it couldn't do it. The only thing that the old law could do was provide a knowledge of sin. And from that knowledge of sin came an understanding of what unrighteousness is. This board needs to be a little wider. What is unrighteousness? Well, now we know, because we differentiate our behavior, which is imperfect and sinful, from that of God, who is perfectly pure. How about the gospel? The gospel is here because it gives us what? What does God do through the gospel? Particularly the sacrifice. What is he able to do? Pardon? Forgiveness. From the gospel comes forgiveness. Was the old law ever intended to provide forgiveness? No. The old law was intended to provide a knowledge of sin. Did it do it perfectly? Yes. It fulfilled. Nice move there, Clay. Yes, it did. It provided a knowledge of sin perfectly. But it could not produce righteousness. And that's what Paul is trying to tell the Galatians and the churches there. The old law cannot provide righteousness. The old law actually defines unrighteousness. Is the law then contrary to the promises of God? No. We need this to help us fully understand this. Is the law then contrary to the promise of God? May it never be. For if a law had been given which was able to impart life, then righteousness would indeed have been based on law. But it can't do that. However, the gospel, because it provides forgiveness, produces what? Take the UN off of this. What do you got? Righteousness. So Paul has to go to really an extra measure, because he's got those who are not Jews in the congregations that he's teaching. And we're seeing a thread to go through the entire 6 chapters of Galatia. Travis and Vance did an excellent job of helping us to understand in more detail each of the chapters, but we're seeing an overall trend or a context that covers that. In chapter 4, but when the fullness of the time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he what? Might redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, Gentiles, now you're beginning to understand this term. And hopefully the Jews are being impressed with where they have deserted the gospel, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. What does Mosaical law produce? We're going to see it in a minute. What does the Mosaical law produce? Because it gives a knowledge of sin, and it provides no measure to get rid of the sin, then what are you? You're guilty. You're under bondage. You're a slave. It produces slavery. Slavery to what? To sin, to, starts with a D, 5 letters. Sin produces death. Sin produces death. So Paul is trying to get them to understand in this entire letter, you don't want to incorporate things from the law of Moses into your worship. You want to stick strictly to the gospel. And they had those who wanted to incorporate things from Moses' law into their worship. Primarily is what? Circumcision, having a tough time. Matter of fact, when Paul, Barnabas, and Titus went up to Jerusalem, there as he was talking about in chapter 2, that's what they addressed, is circumcision. There were those who said you got to be circumcised to be saved. And that's as foreign to the gospel as you can get. The gospel produces forgiveness, which makes us righteous. What does it produce in us? If this is slavery, what's this? Freedom. And if you try to incorporate things of the Old Testament into your worship according to the gospel, you're going from a free state to a what? Going back to a slave state. And that's what Paul's saying. If you allow these people who are disturbing you to continue, you're putting yourself back in bondage. And Christ died for nothing. Christ died for nothing. So as we go through the Galatian letter and we get to chapter 6, we're going to find out how what Paul says in chapter 6 has to do with the overall context. Later on in chapter 4, and you, brethren, like Isaac, are children of promise. They were forgetting that. And he had to remind them. But as at that time, he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so it is now also. Who was the one who was persecuting him that was born according to the Spirit? Who are they talking about? Person, name. Ishmael, Hagar's son, that was born to Hagar. Ishmael, he persecuted whom? Starts with another I. Isaac. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman. If you're an heir of Christ, then you're the son of Sarah, who represented Jerusalem from above. So then, brethren, we are not children of bondwoman, but of the free woman. Chapter 5. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh, for the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. For these are opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under law. That's what he's talking about all along the Galatian letter. Now, he gets to chapter 6. Brethren, even if a man is caught up in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, lest you too be tempted. The two problems, they were deserting the gospel. There's a movie, Mr. Mom, Michael Keaton. He loses his job. Now he's got to stay home and raise the kids. And he takes them to school. First day he goes to school, he goes in the out. And his kids say, "This is the wrong way, Dad. You can't go this way. Don't go this way, Dad. This is wrong." "No, this is all right. I'll do it. I'll go it this way." And one of the women come up, tap, tap, tap. "You're doing it wrong." That's what Paul is saying. You're doing it wrong. Now, the natural follow-up to you're doing it wrong is what? You have a little child that's misbehaved. You're not supposed to do that. What should follow? How to do it right. How to do it right. That's what Paul is doing. You're doing it wrong. Here's how you do it right. What did he say in chapter 5? If you walk by the Spirit, if you are led by the Spirit, you cannot follow what these people are saying. You have to follow what the gospel says. You have to walk by the Spirit. You're doing it wrong. You got to do it right. Well, the second problem is there were members disturbing other members. And so Paul was saying, in effect, you can't listen to them because they're steering you wrong. You're doing it wrong. Now, unfortunately, a negative byproduct of that is nobody talks to anybody. There's no communication. There's no communication. Paul says, here's doing it right. Here is doing it right. Brethren, if a man is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. You were doing it wrong? Here's what you do that is right. That's why chapter 6 is so important to the context of Galatians. Bear one another's burdens and thus fulfill the law of Christ. Let me go on. He says, for even if a man is caught in any trespass, what constitutes a trespass? If you look it up in the Vincent's word studies, one of the quotes I found is regarding that Greek term, caught in any trespass, not detected in any act by some else before he can escape, but surprised by the fault itself, hurried into error. So what that word, caught in trespass, includes is kind of an unaware state. You're doing it wrong and you don't realize where that's going to lead you. And that's what he's referring it to. Someone has overstepped and they don't realize it, and the end is going to be rather tragic if someone doesn't turn them around. We have two excellent examples of that here in the book of Galatians. What's the first one? Chapter 1. You're doing it wrong. Did they know they were doing it wrong? No. They thought they were okay. So there was an element of unawares there. They thought, what do you mean we're doing it wrong? We're trying to follow the gospel. We're trying to worship. But Paul says you're doing it wrong. He's catching them and they're unaware. So he's trying to turn them around because it's very necessary. That's what the word caught in some fault would mean. What's the second very good example in Galatians? What happens in chapter 2? Peter, when Peter comes to Antioch, Paul says, I opposed him to his face. In other words, the path he had taken would lead to some place where he didn't need to be, shouldn't be, and would not be helpful for those who were with him. So there's two very examples of what Paul is saying there in chapter 6, the Galatian churches and the example of Peter there in chapter 2. Timothy says, now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. He goes on, verse 26, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil, having been held captive by him to do his will. That's where they were heading. The snare of the devil. But Paul caught them. Going on in that passage. Brethren, even if a man is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one. Does that phrase make you a little nervous? You who are spiritual. Deer caught in a headlight, a lot of those. Does it make you a little nervous? Well, it should. Because it requires that you do what? Examine yourself. He said, you who are spiritual. He didn't say who that was. He just says, you who are spiritual. And so we got to look introspectively and see, what does that mean, and am I it? Because that's what we're all shooting for, to be spiritual. Well, fortunately, Paul goes on to answer that question there in that very book. Romans 15, now we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength. We have an idea from that particular passage there in Romans. That's a little bit soon. Okay, Romans talks about those who are without strength. He actually answers the question, you who are spiritual, in the book itself. Notice in chapter 6 there of Galatians. Bear one another's burdens. Are you bearing others' burdens? That's the question you have to ask yourself. If you're going to say, am I spiritual? Am I doing this? Am I helping other Christians, other members? For if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. Verse 4. But each one must examine his own work, for then he will have reason for boasting. Do I examine myself honestly? Do I examine myself honestly? Is what he's saying. That's what it takes to be spiritual. He's answering his own, in a sense, he's answering his own question. For each one will bear his own load. Am I willing to bear my own load? These are questions you just ask yourself, and if you can answer yes to them, you are spiritual. We can even back up into chapter 5, because that verse is an extension of chapter 5. What did he say about the gifts of the Spirit? We receive them if we do what? If we are led by the Spirit. We are led by the Spirit. That's what helps us to be spiritual. And those who are spiritual then are the ones who have to help others who have been caught, in whatever mistake it might be. It talks about bearing one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. What is that? To bear one another's burdens. To help each other out. That's why I have that picture. The members here bore the burdens of countless numbers of members in the Philippines. And that's one of the ways they did it. They donated. We sent funds over. It turned out to be about 196,000 pesos. We bought over 4 tons of rice for 5 different areas. This is bearing one another's burdens. Globally, locally, do we bear one another's burdens? Yesterday afternoon, in my mind, was an excellent example. There were a lot of members in this congregation who kicked in and helped the Flad family in their service and respect to their father. That's bearing one another's burdens. The list goes on and on and on. We have careers in this life. We have engineers. We have railroad people. We have teachers. We have nurses. But those careers come to an end and we retire. We don't retire. We never retire from bearing one another's burdens. We got that all of our life. And if we're willing to do that, we fall into that category of you who are scriptural. Going on, verse 6, and let one who has taught the word share all good things with him who teaches. Is referring to what? What's our practice today that we often do that? We support preachers. We support preachers and teachers. We do so locally in this country, and we do so globally. We appreciate those who make the extra effort, and devote themselves to helping us to be stronger. Paul says, if we do that, you owe them, and we'll use the term wages, at least wages of some sort. Sometimes we went up to Course Gold, and they provide a double-wide trailer for their preacher. That helps to support them. We can do that in many ways. Hopefully, we can do it morally in our appreciation for the service, not only in payment, but in support. For the one who sows to his own flesh shall reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit shall from the Spirit reap eternal life. Very easy principle to understand. If we give nothing, what do we reap? Nothing. That's a principle that we find in other places within the New Testament. That's what we have to remember. If we sow nothing, we reap nothing. If we give nothing, we reap nothing. If we withhold our services, we reap no services from anyone else. That's just a principle that we find in the Scriptures, which unfortunately is very foreign to our society today, but we won't go there. And let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we shall reap if we do not grow weary. How does God support financially the spread of the gospel? Through the church members. So if in his wisdom there's more funds needed to spread the gospel by the congregation, how does he provide those additional funds? Through whom? The members. Through the members. So if there's more need, God provides more resources, is what it amounts to. To which members will he provide those resources? The ones he knows will give it, will pass it on, will be generous. If he's generous with it, he's generous with them because he knows that they are generous with what he provides. It's just a very simple principle. But that's what sowing involves. Verse 9, and let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we shall reap if we do not grow weary. You who are spiritual, what are you doing? You're sowing. You're sowing. And you're sowing generously. Now, the amount is immaterial. It's the willingness, as he says in Romans 12, verse 8. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all men, especially those who are of the household of faith. You're doing it wrong. Here's how you do it right. Now, if he didn't provide that, he just said there's those who are disturbing you. What might be an unwelcome problem there? We're so hesitant about listening to others that we don't listen to anyone. We don't listen to anyone. And in verse 1, he said we need to bear one another's burdens. What does that require? Listening, communication. It requires communication. And so what he's trying, not only is he saying you're doing it wrong, he provides what it means to do it right. To do it right. And so throughout this entire book, that's what Paul has sought to accomplish. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we should reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Nevertheless, we do not use the right, but we endure all things that we might cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. He expected them to support him, but he was not going to expect them to support him if it caused problems in him trying to teach them. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share with the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. We owe it to them. They've devoted their life to helping our life. We devote it to them, is what Paul is saying there. Verse 9, and let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we shall reap if we do not grow weary. That's where the spiritual person excels. They don't give up. It gets to the dog days, and they don't give up. Be patient, therefore, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Behold, the farmer waits for the precious produce of soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and late rains. That proves how spiritual we are, is how patient we're able to be. And so when Paul says, you who are spiritual, and it creates in our mind question, he then answers that question as he goes through the rest of the chapter. It says, see with what large letters I'm writing to you with my own hand. Now there's a lot of many different reasons why it says that amongst the commentators. Some believe that he was having trouble with Greek. What was Paul's mother tongue? What did he speak growing up? What language? He was a Jew. No? What did he teach growing up? What did Jesus, what language did he teach with? Aramaic. Jesus spoke Aramaic. Paul spoke Aramaic. That was his daily language. But Paul was very skilled in the scriptures, so what other language did he speak? Old Hebrew, yes. And it might be that he's having trouble with Greek, so he writes with big letters. When you teach kids how to write, what do they usually do? Make big letters. That may be the case. Or the other possibility is he's emphasizing the point he wants to make to them. What do we usually do? Bold text if we want them to understand it, to emphasize what that could be. Or he's probably pushing 50. And what happens at 40? He's starting needing glasses. They didn't have Ray-Ban in Paul's day, so it might be hard to see. Most likely, though, what do most people think? Why he wrote with big letters? He had affliction with his eyes. Matter of fact, he backs up. We read in chapter 5 where he talks about their patience with him. They would even have taken their own eyes out and given them to him. So that's probably one of the problems. Anyway, one last point. What appeared to be I lost the rest of my PowerPoint. So what appeared to be the overall problem? What appeared to be what they were trying to introduce into the gospel? What rite of the law of Moses? Circumcision. Why? There's an interesting reason provided here in Galatians chapter 6, verse 12. Those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised simply so that they will what? Not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. Why were they trying to introduce circumcision into, most likely circumcision into the congregation? What did Paul say? What were they afraid of happening? Persecution by whom? The Jews who rejected the gospel. And Paul gets down to the simplicity of the problem. And that's chapter 6. So thank you very much for your attention. And how fast is the clock? 5 minutes? Well, good. I'm only 1 minute late. Thank you very much.